10. Hebrews chapter. After Easter, as we did last week, to continue this week in the book of Hebrews and show the complete work of Christ. Hebrews 10:1. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, it can never make perfect those who draw near to worship. And this is in reference to the Old Testament law. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Verse 5. Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. Then I said, Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, O God." First he said, sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, although the law required them to be made. Then he said, "Here I am, I have come to do your will." He sets aside the first to establish the second. And by that will, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties again and again. He offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down. He sat down at the right hand of God. And since that time, he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. Because by one sacrifice, he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. The Holy Spirit also testifies to us about this. First he says, "This is the covenant I will make with them. After that time, says the Lord, I will put my laws in their hearts, and I will write them on their minds." And then he adds, "Their sins and lawless acts I will remember no more. And where these have been forgiven, there is no longer any sacrifice for sin." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Excuse me. Yesterday, and soon after we began to date, I began myself. And those portraits immediately became what I think is the greatest wedding sermon of all time. And then Tabitha became mine. All of a sudden, I moved from possession of a one-dimensional photo to possession of the real thing, who laughed and talked and organized things obsessively. It's a three-dimensional wife, a human being. And the pictures, they remained just as beautiful, but from then on they received less attention. Now imagine that one day I walk up to Tabitha, holding an old photograph of her. And I say, "My dearest Tabitha, my dearest Tabitha, oh how I have missed your picture. I'm going back to it. I'm going back to your picture. I'm so attached to its beauty, the color of your eyes, your hair." And then imagine I passionately embrace the photograph. I hold it tight and I clutch it to my heart. And I walk away speaking to it, "Oh, how I love you, my photograph. My photograph of my wife, you are everything to me." What would you say? You'd think I was crazy. You'd think I was nuts. Why? Well, because I was trading the real thing for a paper-thin picture that isn't flesh and blood. A shadow is a pale reflection without detail or substance. How absurd for anyone, once having the substance, the real thing, how absurd to go back to the shadow. Yet some people in the early church were forsaking God's covenant of grace and doing two things. Number one, they were incorporating parts of the Old Testament ceremonial ritual law as necessary for salvation. And number two, they were creating new rituals, claiming that those rituals were part of the means for salvation. That started to happen in the early church. Now, for 2,000 years, the book of Hebrews has helped Christians understand that, one, Jesus perfectly fulfills God's covenant law, that we cannot. And Hebrews helps us understand that we cannot earn our salvation by keeping God's old covenant, because even it was imperfect. Hebrews helps us understand that salvation is by the once-for-all sacrifice of Jesus. Once-for-all sacrifice means he's not being sacrificed again and again and again. Hebrews helps us see the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant. And both of those things we just mentioned over there, they take away from the gospel of grace. They return to works. First, let's talk about the problem of imperfection. Hebrews 10:1, the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. One of my favorite things to do with my kids is draw with sidewalk chalk. We almost always will lay down on the driveway whenever we start with sidewalk chalk. We'll lay down on the driveway and we'll trace each other's outline around our head, around our outstretched arms and legs, or sometimes on a sunny day we'll trace each other's outline and color it in. Any of you could come to my house and you could tell us apart. You could easily recognize enough details to say, okay, that's Pastor Shaylin, that's Tabitha, that's Ellie, that's Levi. You could tell. But is it really me? Is it really me? If I stood beside that sidewalk chalk sketch, that rough sketch, how much more real am I, flesh and blood, than that sidewalk chalk sketch? The law is only a shadow, a pale reflection, a silhouette of the real thing. Now, the law is good, but it always and ever points towards Jesus. The Ten Commandments, the Book of the Covenant, the Tabernacle liturgy only foreshadow the reality of Jesus Christ. And as a shadow, the Old Covenant had imperfections. It did not adequately deal with sin, true cleansing, the conscience. Hebrews says, for this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers have been cleansed once and for all, and would no longer have felt guilty, the conscience, for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Let's talk about an imperfect cleansing. Have you ever had a stain in a favorite piece of clothing, and that stain would just not come out? I remember my mom used to buy us, she would buy us Sunday clothes. And her number one rule, don't stain it. Don't stain it. Don't go out in that churchyard in those good clothes and stain those knees. Be careful when you're eating. Don't stain those Sunday clothes. We've all had clothes and gotten a stain in them, and the stain just wouldn't come out no matter what you did. The spray and wash, the Tide stain stick, shout it out. Didn't work. You may have washed a shirt, and technically it's clean, but the stain remains. God speaks the people. Walk in all the ways I command you, that it may go well with you. But they couldn't. They were incapable of keeping the law perfectly. God needed them to understand, you can't keep the law. You need someone who can on your behalf. In Psalm 51, King David says to the Lord, you do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken, contrite, repentant heart. That's what that means, a repentant heart. Oh God, you will not despise. David says you won't turn away a repentant heart. Now, why bring this up? Because we see that every Old Testament office, the Lord says, I from a prophet and a king. They also, Old Testament offices, prophet, priest, painfully aware, they understand that we need a new and better covenant. Because the people cannot obey, and sacrifices of bulls aren't enough to cover their sin. The sacrifices have to be repeated. Sin is cleansed. The conscience isn't cleared. The sin remains. The whole system was imperfect. And when you have an imperfect cleansing, you have an imperfect conscience. You have an imperfect conscience. The old covenant could not effectively deal with sin, and that produces another imperfection, a guilty conscience. And that's perfectly illustrated by America's favorite two household pets, the cat and the dog. How many of you are dog people? Raise your hand. How many of you are cat people? Raise your hand. Okay. Well, here's two. Cat, anything. Never. A dog may lie, but a dog will look away in shame when it's confronted with a mess. Y'all know. Boldly. A dog will bury its head, look down, tuck its tail. A dog will hide in shame, look at you from around the corner. And then come to love on you and give you, put his paw on you. Why? Because the dog knows it has broken your sacred law, disappointed you, and the dog expresses a guilty conscience. The cat is a whitewashed tomb. The cat is a Pharisee. Confront a cat with the most egregious offense, and their conscience won't be pricked in the slightest. They do not care. A cat will look at you stone cold in the face, not caring, then walk off indifferent to what they've done. It's just the truth. When you correct a cat, the ultimate Pharisee, it stares at you, thanking God he is not like the sinner dog or like you, a lowly human. It's the truth. And here's the truth. If you were to die in your house, a dog would wait a lot longer to would. That cat's going to have dinner. All right? The dog's conscience shows shame and remorse, and he feels the weight of guilt. The cat's conscience doesn't see its own sin. It might even be seared. If you feed a dog, you've heard the illustration. If you feed a dog, that dog thinks you're the best thing ever. This person must be God. If you feed a cat, the cat thinks, this servant is feeding me because I must be God. It's true. Under the old covenant, your mind must trust in God's faithfulness to forgive. But your conscience, your inner moral discernment has a sense that sin's affection still runs in your veins. There's still guilt. Under the old covenant, God lovingly accepted this insufficient sacrifice out of his goodness. Of that sacrifice. Beasts could give the guilty conscience rest or wash away one stain. And what is the result? Memorialized imperfection. Hebrews 10:3, those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. The pilgrimage, the rituals, the ceremonies, the standing of the all pointed to the problem. The entire liturgy pointed to the problem. The shadow of the old covenant pointed to the need for forgiveness and a clear conscience. We have a clear conscience. But the old covenant could not make perfect those who the photograph, so to speak, pictured what could be, and it activated an ache for the reality. We move to the divine dialogue and disposition. Here I am, I have come to do your will. Jesus sets aside the first to establish the second. And by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. The fact was that though God had instituted animal sacrifices, he had never been pleased with them and did not see them as adequate ends. He had object lesson his people about the sinfulness of their hearts and about his hatred of sin. Sin leads to death. He gave these sacrifices as illustrations of the need for atonement, and that he was delighted in those whose hearts were clean. God delights in those whose hearts are clean, who want to be obedient, and who want to be faithful. But there was nothing appealing to God about the sight and sounds of a lamb in the throes of death. Nothing appealing about that. What he did find pleasure in was those who offered a sacrifice with a repentant, obedient heart. That's what pleased God, a contrite heart. Jesus is not like an unwilling. Jesus is the opposite. Jesus is a mindful, willing human being, yet fully God. And he says to the Father, "Behold, I have come to do your will." Later in Hebrews 12, we are told that Jesus endured the cross for the joy set before him. The joy. Jesus has exuberant determination and eagerness to obey. And you see that through my will, but the Father. What God desired from every worshiper in the Old Covenant. Jesus obeyed with a whole heart, with a. That's what God wanted. That is the sacrifice. Everything else is ashes if we are not living in obedience to God. Really in our hearts wanting to obey. Even when we fall, we want to obey. We want to be faithful. We're repentant. So perfect. Sacrifice is never. The result of Jesus, the results of his sacrifice are equally final. Christ died once for all. Once for all. This phrase is used by the Apostle Paul in his magnum opus, the book of Romans, in which he details faith. Again by the Apostle Peter in his first epistle. Once